SECfans.com. Week 9 is here. Week 8 is in the books. Got some teams off this week, but that's going to give us an opportunity to talk about a few other teams that we haven't shown some love in previous weeks that we're excited to show some love to this week. Obviously got Husky Pup in the house. He's going to talk some numbers with me this week. Want to thank everybody, as always, for just, coming back week in, week out, even with our audio issues last week. We got some good, clean audio for you this week. And, hey, let's get into it. So 3 games we're going to talk about. We're going to touch on Georgia, Florida, maybe a little bit of shine off of that game, but every year still has some sort of impact on the SEC East and overall SEC race. Going to talk about Tennessee and South Carolina because that also impacts the SEC East. Even if you don't, know much about South Carolina, we're going to get into that a little bit. And then our game of the week, Ole Miss and Auburn, 2 teams that look like they might be going in opposite directions, but maybe there's something hidden in the numbers that we can discover. So let's get into it. First game, Husky, Georgia, Florida cocktail party, always kind of a big fun game. And this year, a little bit different dynamic for these 2 teams. Florida is sitting at a very quiet 5-1 right now. Skipped the LSU game, which would have given us an opportunity to know a little bit about them that maybe was still a bit of a mystery. Georgia, we know a lot about them right now, and it's a bit of a struggle. They had to sit on their hands for a week after losing to Vanderbilt. They wanted to get right back into it. They wanted to play somebody, kind of erase that bad taste in their mouth, but they had to sit and think about it for a week. Could be a good thing, could be a bad thing, but get us into the numbers on this one. Georgia, Florida, cocktail party, big game. Let's go.
We've talked all year, right, that Georgia was going to go as far as Jacob Eason's arm is going to be able to carry them. Dating back to the North Carolina game and the opener, I sort of cataloged, right, that when Jacob Eason completed a pass or just attempted one, they scored almost every drive. I think it was 4 or 5 drives. And when Lambert attempted a pass, they were more like 1 of 4, 1 of 5 scoring. So the transition for Georgia has been, how long could they keep up some sort of offense with a true freshman quarterback without really suffering any sort of downtime, without suffering any sort of period where they were struggling with consistency, because again, he's a true freshman. He's going to have good days, he's going to have bad days, and they've just kind of run out of steam. It's disappointing. I think if you're a Georgia fan, I think probably extremely frustrating. Their passing offense has fallen all the way down to 11th in the conference in yards per attempt. The rushing game, notably, is only sitting right about average at 8th. They haven't even played necessarily great run defenses. I think that's important to note.
They haven't played great teams.
Right, and they're statistically bad. And that Vandy loss, it was just baffling, right? I think that's sort of a microcosm for the whole season, because on one hand, you look at it at the end of that game, and you've got Nick Chubb in the backfield, and you use him as a decoy fullback, and you toss the ball to the smallest player on the field, McKenzie. Great playmaker, no doubt, but you're using him as a deep tailback, hoping he can get the edge. And sure enough, the whole problem with a 160-pound player, one really good All-American linebacker, all he's got to do is grab him by the jersey, and he throws him straight backwards. And all you needed was a yard. But I say it's a microcosm because it's a lot of focus on one bad moment and sort of ignoring the fact that, but they also failed to score the whole rest of that ball game. You shouldn't have never been in that situation. Similarly, the Tennessee and the Hail Mary play, Georgia had 4 quarters to beat Tennessee. They didn't lose that game on a Hail Mary. They lost it when they managed to squander a lot of golden opportunities. They squandered a huge lead, double-digit lead in that ball game. And so, the frustration and ineffectiveness breeds ineffectiveness, right? If you don't want to be exposed for making some, poor decisions or failing in crunch time, the best way to do that is avoiding being in crunch time to start with. So, whatever Georgia's potential is as a team, I think it's first and foremost important to remember that Georgia has struggled in crucial situations because they've put themselves in bad situations.
So is where Georgia is and how they're executing right now a reflection of, I mean, just to take a step back, I think for a lot of people inside that program and even outside the program, the perception was, and maybe this is why the expectations were where they were to start the season, the perception was loaded with talent, just needed the guy at the top to take them to the promised land, to get them to get them over that hump. So is that the case where we're seeing a coach in Kirby Smart not able to get that done in his first year, or are they not as talented as maybe people think?
Well, I never really expected them to be that great, and that's because I'm not going to say they weren't as talented as people think. It's that the talent really isn't even. The talent isn't old enough, and so it was always going to be a couple years probably before they get there. I mean, they didn't have any talent receiver. That was their Achilles heel last year. You can talk about the poor quarterback play, but my red flag was, they only had really the only guy they had to throw to last year was Malcolm Mitchell. Everybody else was subpar. Last year, they lose Malcolm Mitchell. So who the heck do you throw to? McKenzie has been somewhat explosive for them. But McKenzie is the kind of guy you want as a second or third receiver as a compliment, right? The NFL, they don't use Dexter McCluster as the primary receiver. And the fact that he's having to act as that primary playmaker role is bad. The fact that Chubb is getting way too much focus, which is getting him banged up and he's getting injured. They have 2 starting offensive tackles. They lost 6 of 7 leading tacklers from last year. So even though they've got talent, arguably, the talent isn't even, again, there's a lot of young talent in the front 7. A lot of it's unproven. All of it's young. There's no talent at receiver. There's a baffling lack of talent at offensive tackle. They have pretty well failed to recruit. They have a ton of talent at quarterback, none of which has panned out until Eason, this 5-star. And then they've got a ton of talent log-jammed at running back. So it's just a disjointed team that, I frankly feel like Kirby Smart kind of inherited a mess. Now, I'm not really excusing him because he took a mess and he still shouldn't have lost to Vanderbilt. But at the same time, I was really critical of my preseason write-up on Mark Richt because I felt like Mark Richt, really hasn't quite panned out as well as you might think, especially given what really has been a pretty easy slate. He's only played in his whole 11 years at Georgia. He only played 16 top 10 matchups, and of those 16, he only won 2, and he only won 32% of his top 25 matches. So really struggled against good competition. He didn't have an all-around rounded team. He's had a couple good years, but Smarts has kind of inherited a disjointed mess. All that said, let's turn this back to this ball game a little bit, and I'm going to give you a little bit of spark of hope, and that's that for all the fact that Georgia, by the way, is fallen again all the way to 11th in yards per attempt. Well, they're playing a team that you don't really want to throw the ball against anyway in Florida, right? And Georgia's one thing they can do is they can run the ball some. We saw Tennessee have some success running and just hitting random passes deep. Jacob Eason can do that. But crucially, what does Florida do? Well, Florida is, again, pretty mediocre, 6th in the conference. In rushing, they're all the way down in 9th in passing. I know they've lost Del Rio, but still not real great. And the one thing Georgia has been consistently able to do this year is they've been able to stop the run, 3.57 yards per attempt allowed. That's pretty good. They're right. There's going to be a lot of talk about how good Florida's rush defense is at allowing 3.2 yards per carry. And I think there's going to be not nearly enough time spent talking about the fact that, yeah, they allow 3.2, but Georgia only allows 3.5. They're right neck and neck there. And Georgia has been very young. They've gotten better. Vandy did not move the ball very well in the game. They lost to Vandy because they couldn't score, not because they couldn't really stop them. So Yeah, I think that's the ray of hope, right? That the second best pass defense in the conference is Florida. The 14th, the worst pass defense in the conference is Georgia right now. They are the worst per attempt team. The advantage they have against Florida is not a passing team. The only guy they have really that was doing anything was Callaway. They showed up a little bit Cleveland in the last game, but there's a pretty good chance that Georgia can stymie the Florida run game, and that may be the one thing that gives them a shot in this ball game.
So I think it's also worth noting, although I will say with a caveat that I think Florida's defense is actually really good, and I think their secondary is fantastic. However, that 3.2 yards per carry, there's not a team on their schedule. Keep in mind, Florida's just getting their season going. I know it sounds crazy in week 9, but they've played UMass, Kentucky, North Texas, Tennessee, Vanderbilt, and Missouri. So they've played a bunch of horrible teams plus, Tennessee. And in that Tennessee game, they gave up 3.9 yards per carry, which isn't necessarily stellar given the fact that Tennessee doesn't run it well, but they also gave up 319 yards passing. So there are some holes in this defense, and there is potentially, to your point about giving kind of a ray of sunshine, even though I haven't heard your prediction. I know both of us are probably going to predict Florida. I see some things here where we don't necessarily know how good Florida is. Where Auburn was last week, I think Florida is now 5-1, haven't beaten anybody that matters, lost to the only team they played with the Pulse. So I wouldn't be shocked if Georgia won this game. Keep in mind, Florida played Vanderbilt about as poorly as Georgia, maybe a little bit poorer, just had, 13 points and didn't give up a 95-yard kick return. So, they beat them 13-7. Vanderbilt beat Georgia, 17-16. So I'm with you. I think there is, some potential there for Georgia to make some noise. But I think this is going to be an ugly game. For just kind of a little bit of a funny side note, when we're doing our agenda, Husky emailed me the agenda, and it was UGA versus UG, and it's just it's just one of those games where it's hard for me to get excited for. It's frustrating because I love this game. For people who enjoy going to games, if you're not a fan of either one of these teams, this is still one of those games that needs to be on your bucket list. The cocktail party is awesome. These two teams are a lot of fun. These two fan bases are a lot of fun, and they've had some epic matchups in the past, but right now, it's hard for me to get excited for it.
Right. And I think you bring up a really interesting point, and it's something to sort of keep in mind when you're pegging this game, and a lot of people will think Florida should be favored handily. Florida-Vandy game there's not a lot of common opponents, even at this point in the season, but they both played Vandy, right? And Florida won 13-6. Georgia lost 16-17. Georgia scored 16. They scored more than Florida did against Vandy, right? And as you noted, the deciding factor in that game is really that Vandy had a kick return touchdown. So, and if you look at rushing numbers, Vandy averaged 3.9 yards against Florida. They only averaged 1.9 against Georgia. So in a lot of ways, Georgia actually played better against Vandy than Florida did. And this goes back to something we talked about in our recaps, that anytime you get that point total below 25, and especially if it's below 20, it gets really, there's a tremendous amount of variance, right? Because one catch here, versus a drop, one dropped interception, one block, and a kick return equals 7 points. And when the yardage numbers are that low, points get really hard to come by. Well, points also end up getting really random. So anytime the score is two teams that are both below 20 points, that Clemson game, the LSU against Auburn, LSU, they've got a couple of them. You're going to end up with a pretty random, weird result. And so taking it a step further, as you said, I think it's really important to realize with the LSU game rescheduled, just how, and with Florida having had a bye, Florida's only played 6 games. They've played 2 of those were non-conference, and North Texas and Massachusetts were absolute pushovers. Didn't look great in either one of those. And in the East, they played Kentucky, Vandy, and Missouri. And then the only other team they played was Tennessee, right? And that Tennessee game was something of a devastating loss. So what we're getting at here is Florida's only played, in my opinion, one real game. And in that one real game, it was a disaster. So calling them a 5-1 team is not just kind of deceptive, but maybe really, really deceptive going into this Georgia game.
And I'll go one step further to piss off Florida fans who are listening and encourage Georgia fans who are listening. Florida ranked at 12th in the coaches poll is ridiculous. I mean, we see this every week, and it's a bit of a sidebar, but coaches poll generally has a healthy amount of crack smoke going on in it. And this week, I think some of the crack smoke is whoever's voting Florida anywhere near 12th. It's just not, I mean, yes, there is one 5-2 ranked 2-loss team ahead of them in Wisconsin, but they haven't played anybody, and the one team they played really beat the crap out of them. So,
well, I mean, let's note one of the teams behind them, and that's Tennessee. Florida
beat the crap out of them,
right? Yeah, Florida's 5-1. Tennessee is 5-2 because due to the reschedule, they've actually played an extra game. And who were Tennessee's 2 losses? Well, that would be to number 10 Texas A&M and number 1 Alabama. And who does Florida played or beaten? Well, they've only played one top 25 team. Oh, by the way, they lost to them. Oh, by the way, the team they lost to, you just ranked 6 spots lower than Florida. It makes absolutely no sense.
And saying all of that, this is the point where we both say that Florida's going to win. So I'll let you go first.
The line in this game, I think, I don't talk about betting lines a whole lot. I don't put a lot of stock in them. I say a lot of stock in them. I don't put a lot of interest in them. I try to always make my predictions and analysis without paying attention to the betting lines. More often than not, when I go back and look at the betting lines, it's usually right on what I expected it to be. Interestingly, right, our model was a point off from the Alabama-Texas A&M line, and the end result ended up splitting the betting line and our model last week. And here, I think Florida is probably a touchdown better than Georgia. I don't think Georgia's a very good team, but I think Florida's probably only a touchdown better. And yeah, that's telling. I don't know who Florida's going to lose to the rest of the season. It's going to be funny if they win the East, but yeah, for all the reasons I said, I think this game stays close. I think Georgia can stop the run. The one big glaring problem is that Georgia is right now statistically the worst passing defense in the conference, despite having really, partly because they have faced Ole Miss, and when Ole Miss was on point, that did not help them. But, a lot of the other teams like Missouri is not really that great, but they made Missouri look phenomenal. And with Jack Del Rio back, Florida can actually operate a balanced offense. That's enough to give me some spark. And I would pick Florida, and I think Florida, pretty good chance they do win by multiple scores at the end of the day. I don't think the game is going to be that lopsided, but I think it may end up with a multiple score win just because Georgia's going to be in bad shape if they throw the ball a lot. But there's that huge red flag of the Tennessee game that Jacob Eason has the ability to push the ball vertically. And Florida's corners in man coverage are tremendous athletes and make great plays on the ball. But the moment you make them start having to switch coverage and defend guys downfield and you can push the ball downfield, all season long we've shown they have in dating back to last year, they have a tendency to lose the ball in the air, lose guys in coverage. And Georgia, with the quarterback they have, is a team that's capable of exploiting that.
I think you touched on the big point for me and why I'm going to pick Florida, and that's Luke Del Rio. And it's not because he's just lighting up the scoreboard or lighting up the stat sheet. Even against Missouri, 18 of 38, 236 with 3 interceptions. but I do think he's a little bit more of a calming force than Appleby was, and a little bit more capable when you need him to throw. I don't think Georgia's played horrible defense this year, which has kind of gone a little bit unnoticed. Everybody's going to remember the 45 they gave up to Ole Miss, but Ole Miss was on that day. So I think Georgia has a chance to hold Florida. Florida, off the top of my head, I think Florida had like 258 total yards against Vanderbilt. But yeah, I think you're right. I think it's probably a 24-17 type game with maybe some defensive turnover, defensive touchdown weirdness, special teams weirdness. I'm going to say 24-17 Florida, but pretty ugly game overall.
Yeah, and getting back to a conversation both of us were making earlier, we're in that sub 25 point land where anything can happen. I mean, and I know it's kind of cliche and it sounds crappy, but anytime you're that low scoring, it's random kick return or whatnot, and that kick return is the only reason that Georgia lost to Vandy and Florida did not, and that's you're in that realm here, I think, with this game.